Coronavirus shows cash is king. My name is Brendan Murphy.
And I'm Kelly McKebney. So for financial analysis, the balance sheet is not the most important statement that we look at. This is because the balance sheet does not show companies' ability to generate profit. The balance sheet numbers are based more on historical costs rather than current dollars. So therefore, it doesn't show the overall performance of a company in that current year. During financial crises, the balance sheets are important because they indicate a company's liquidity. So they show the cash on hand. They show the creditworthiness for a company, indicating how much they can borrow and lend. And they show how a company can cover their debts with the debt to equity ratio. Strategic management and balance sheets. Utilizing strategic management when looking at balance sheets, you can analyze and make key decisions regarding liquidity and capital management. Liquidity management is how to meet financial obligations through cash flows, and capital management is analyzing current assets, liabilities, and working capital. During financial crises, this is essential. A main reason for that is that liquidity is the most important thing that investors will look at during financial crises at companies. They're more concerned with their liquidity rather than the profit. This is because having enough cash on hand, you can run a company and their operations as normal without generating a profit, or even if you have to cut costs. So the strategic management will analyze liquidity, and then they can also analyze the cash conversion cycle to see how fast a company can convert their inventory purchases to cash.
The importance of the income statement. The income statement summarizes a company's revenues and expenses over a period, either quarterly or annually. The multi-step income statement includes 4 measures of profitability: gross, operating, pre-tax, and after-tax. And the income statement measures profitability and not the cash flow. Comparing the income statement versus the balance sheet. The balance sheet reports assets, liabilities, and equity, while the income statement reports revenues and expenses that net to a profit or a loss. During a time of crisis, it is important to use the income statement to decide whether a business is generating a sufficient profit to pay off its liabilities. And the importance of statements. The implied opposite of the balance sheet is the income statement. If companies are paying more attention to their balance sheet, they are paying less attention to their income statement, and vice versa. In a time of crisis, performance statistics matter less, being that they are only relevant if a business can survive. Important balance sheet data includes cash on hand. So that means like how long a company can stay afloat and just like how liquid they are to meet all these debt payments and in some cases rent payments, as well as pay off their workers without having to borrow more. And a decent amount of cash on hand gives management ability to pay dividends and repurchase shares. More importantly, it can provide extra wiggle room if the company runs into financial difficulties.
Okay. If we go back and look at some of this, it seems like we spend more time on the income statement and cash flow as opposed to the balance sheet. Why do you think that is? You can put your last slide back up, or the title page.
Because like usually during a crisis, you're not expecting that, like you're mainly focusing on how, not like when you're not analyzing during a crisis, you're looking at how profitable a company is going to be and the dividends they're going to pay and just like their long-term growth.
So we're focusing on growth probably more when we're not in a crisis.
Yeah.
Exactly. And while you're in a crisis, you're focusing to see, honestly, at this point now, how long businesses can survive and keep paying their workers, or have to close operations, and just how the total effect of the coronavirus is going to play on these companies.
So it's really going to hit. You might have a great idea. Your business plan may be solid. What you're selling may be solid, or your service. But if you don't have the cash to pay bills, that good idea won't work.
Exactly.
How did you get into this situation that so many companies seem to be falling apart so quickly?
when looking at companies, as we talked about, most are looking more at profit and growth, so they don't focus as much as the cash on hand. So they're
Okay.
quick to lend out cash in times of not a crisis. So then when they do reach a crisis, their cash is lower.
And also, they were able to borrow debt at a very cheap rate, and their credit lines were kind of extensive. So they were more focusing on growth, and they kind of over leveraged themselves. When like a
Okay.
buyer, when something like this hit, they weren't prepared to meet all these payments because they were assuming that business would go on as usual.
Yeah,
They
and
didn't-
that normal cash would keep coming in.
Exactly.
So that if the revenue was coming in, they're still all right. They didn't want to accumulate too much cash then.
hmm
Interesting. Now, how do you think buybacks and dividends impacted their ability to have enough cash? Do you think they
So,
bought money back, or?
yeah, they definitely companies that had the extra cash left over would repurchase their own stocks. But then now it's in this new stimulus bill, they like all the bailouts, they put in that companies can't buy back stock.
Okay.
They have to like kind of do the right thing with the money instead of trying
Okay.
to just look out for themselves.
Do you think from an investor perspective that you might look at a company that has a lot of cash and say, well, it's not making us any money. Why should we have it? Do you think that's something that happened?
Definitely could have been for some of those companies that went out of the way, but the ones who did have that cash on hand right now, being the Apples and the Facebooks, they're going to be the ones who weather the storm and come out on top in the end. I think so, at least.
Yeah. How do you think, if this is for both you guys, it seems I spent more time on the income statement than the cash flow and not as much on the balance sheet. Should have I spent more time on the balance sheet?
I
Or
think
was I
that,
just doing what companies were doing?
what?
Go ahead.
I think that focusing more on the income statement is more essential. However, discussing like the importance of cash, I think, is like underrated when analyzing companies financially.
hmm
So
I
maybe a
think, yeah.
little like understand more how much like liquidity is important for companies and not as much profit in the long run, always.
hmm
What did you
Yeah.
learn from doing this? Either about
Um,
yourself or about topics?
I think, well, for me especially, understanding how important having the cash on hand is at all times, because as we said, we focus a lot more on the income statement and profits and revenues. So understanding that those aren't always the most important parts of a company when times get rough. It's other factors such as like cash, debt to equity ratios, and things on the balance sheet, because I didn't think that far
Okay.
prior to this.
Yeah, I also think personally, like when I look at financial statements, whether it's for a class or for my own investing, that I never really paid that much attention to cash on hand, like as much as I guess I should have, or like talk about the repercussions that a company not having cash on hand could have in the future, like a problem like this was to come up and happen, and that
Yeah, the repercussions. Yeah.
yeah, and you can like some people's 401ks are getting wiped out. It's a whole, it's sad, honestly.
Why do you think we didn't learn from 2008 when we had a similar thing? Why did we?
I feel like most people say, "Oh, yeah, the stock market comes down and it always comes back up." If you like, keep your money in the market, you will weather the storm and come out on top in the long run, which is true to an extent. But I
Mhm.
don't think people thought the lows would be so low
Okay.
necessarily, and that's where because now it's not just like about companies and it's more about like health to individuals. I think it's
Mhm.
bigger than something that possibly could happen in 2008.
Okay. Because it is a health issue, not just a financial issue.
Yes, exactly.
Because the 2008 was caused by bad credit,
hmm
agreed, where this one, those things were starting to happen, but it was really the health care, the health issue that slammed the brakes on everything.
Exactly.
Okay. What do you think? How do you think this is going to play out? How long do you think it's going to last that we'll all be stay at home, don't do things? How long do you think this is going to last?
I think that this will last Well, I don't know how long, obviously, like the mandatory social distancing will last. I would say probably the end of the month. But I think that the effects of this will last much longer because people are still going to be concerned that the virus is still going to affect people. And I think that individuals are still going to be like weary of going out and going to stores and spending their money just in case the virus happens to relapse based on,
Yeah.
and those with health issues are definitely taking higher precautions in the situation.
Mhm. I also think it's kind of situational how some obviously states are hit harder than others, but I also think that's due to more of like a lack of testing because obviously New York is getting a lot of resources now that we're kind of in the hot spot in the hot zone. But
Mm-hmm.
I guess, yeah, I think it's more situational, but these other states don't exactly know the severity of the virus
Mm-hmm.
yet, which is kind of a scary thing too.
Yeah,
And
it's
then,
unknown.
yep, it's more of an unknown thing. I think that's what a lot of the fear is going around to now is that nobody really knows.
And they waited to do anything. New York was probably one of the first to jump in it on a serious basis.
Yep, and they're still.
And that's only been what, 2.5 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago?
Mhm. Yep.
It's scary. I think the recovery time is going to take longer, but I think people are also going to, if you ran into trouble paying your rent
Hmm.
this month and say you do go back, I suspect you're going to try to save a little bit more money in case this happens again.
Yep.
Yeah.
I definitely think an emergency fund is something a lot of people didn't have before this,
Right. Mm-hmm.
but it definitely shows how important that actually is to people, just in case like, you never know what's going to happen around the world.
Absolutely. Okay. Any closing comments?